This is the InfoMed Consulting Podcast, a show where we have engaging conversations with individuals in the medical technology industry. Sit back and enjoy.
Good morning, Dr. Semete. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great. I think so. Last time we tried doing this, it seems like you're quite a busy person. Understandably, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. I think you have to deal with a lot of a lot of things. Is this something that you ever thought you were ready for, especially the way you started, right? Like right at the beginning of COVID. Yeah, maybe tell me about just the craziness of this demanding job that you do.
Sure. Yeah, I guess no one was ever prepared to have to deal with, a pandemic of such a scale,
Yeah,
but also, in a new role within the regulator, who was a key player in
yeah, for sure.
COVID response. So it completely threw me off. All the plans that I had, that typical 100-day plan was completely out
Yeah,
and messed up. And so
no, I can
I
imagine.
needed to really, operate and kind of prepare themselves to get into, acting quickly with a sense of
Yeah,
urgency.
yeah, great. And for people that don't necessarily know you or even SAHPRA, can you maybe just who is Dr. Boitumelo Semete? What is the story? How did we get to this point? Can you maybe tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I've always been a person who has an interest and a curiosity in the health sector. Initially wanted to do medicine, but I thought I'd be bored, and so I studied genetics because I wanted to understand how diseases come
Can
about.
I? Sorry to interrupt you. I just have to say, I spoke to my previous guest, and he said exactly the same thing. He wanted to study medicine, and then he thought that doctors were like mechanics for humans, and then he decided to study genetics. Is that
Oh, really
that's so weird that it's the second time I'm
interesting.
hearing that.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, and at the time that we were at school, genetics was like the thing at the time,
really.
right? So that's when there
Okay.
was genetic modifying of organisms, etc. So that to me intrigued me a lot more. Wherein I wanted to
Uh huh.
understand how is it that one person could get ill and another one doesn't get ill? Why are we so different, etc. So it was really just a curiosity around that. So that's what got me into the sector. And obviously, you need to study all the way to PhD. I always say in our sector, a PhD is like a basic degree. It's a basic requirement. And so, I was fortunate to be able to do that and did my postdoc overseas and then came back and worked in the country. So, in terms of the health sector, my interest, as I've said, was around how do we help those who need health products and health technologies access those. Having been in
Okay.
R&D for the bulk of my career, we did a lot of innovation. And the challenge was always, how do we commercialize these? So I did a bit of a stint with an incubator where I helped set up a biotechnology incubator, headed up a research group, and then eventually I'm now with the regulator. And, it's all things work together for some good, right? And some of these things are not planned. I never planned to head up a regulator, never in my wildest dreams. But when the opportunity presented itself, I thought one could play a role in addressing this regulatory barrier that a lot of innovators, always mention,
Okay.
and just to see how I can contribute as a person.
Yeah.
So SAHPRA is then the health products regulator in South Africa. We regulate all medicines, all medical devices and in vitro diagnostic tests, as well as complementary medicine. So I always say, many people know the FDA. So we're like the FDA, but a lot smaller, much, much smaller than them.
Yeah, the FDA is a big machine. I think people don't actually realize how much money and resources and human capacity goes into that. I actually want to get a bit sidetracked. So I was speaking to a friend I was telling him, I'm going to have a podcast this coming week with Dr. Tumi, because I guess most people call you Tumi, right? I
Yeah.
think. And
Yeah.
I said Dr. Tumi, and he was like, "Whoa, really, Dr. Tumi?" And it turns out there's a musician by the name of Dr. Tumi. So I
There
just
is.
want to clarify for everyone, this is not the musician. This is the SAHPRA CEO. Just to get that out of the way. I found that really funny.
No,
Or maybe it
indeed.
is you. I don't know.
No, certainly not. I don't have as good a voice as he does. I follow him quite a
Yeah.
bit. He's a talented young man, and I cannot sing to save my life.
Okay, so we have that out of the way for anyone that was confused. So I want to talk about, I don't want to jump straight to SAHPRA. I mean, we will talk about that. So one of the things I've realized is, for me, at least personally, whenever I engage with people on whatever topic, I like getting to understand, the person itself. Because I think what I've seen happening, especially now in the pandemic and like all these things needing to happen in the healthcare sector, what people tend to do is they don't really know the person, and they just know the SAHPRA, and they know that you're the head of SAHPRA. So the only perception of you that they have is SAHPRA. And I think a lot of the times we maybe just miss the human interaction. That's part of why I wanted to have you here, is to actually just get to know the person, right? So you've mentioned you were in R&D, you did your PhD in genetics and all these things. It seems to me that it's kind of a natural progression that a lot of people that are in R&D end up in regulatory. Is this something that you see as a natural progression? Like why would anyone be a regulator except if they understand that side of it?
Yeah, actually, we don't see that in this country, and probably not in the region. A lot of our
Yeah.
researchers, they typically stay in research or actually go into industry. So even if they may be in the regulatory function, it's in the commercial entity. What we're finding with regulation is that a lot of the pharmacists, because regulators typically would start with regulating medicines. And that's a speciality
You
in
mean
the area of
in South
pharmacy.
Africa, specifically,
I
that
think we're
trend of,
seeing it across. I mean, if I look at my colleagues, whether it's the Zimbabwean Authority, Nigerian, Ghana, Tanzania,
Mhm,
the heads of those agencies were
are coming from
pharmacists.
pharmacy.
Yeah, pharmacy
Yeah.
or medical doctors. We don't have a lot of researchers, and that's something that for me, I want to be driving, because researchers understand the R&D, they understand the product development, and so even as we regulate, it's always good to have a mix. So again, I'm a firm believer of diversity, and so I do believe that we should be bringing, researchers, clinicians, and also obviously retaining the pharmacists into our mix of staff.
Okay, that's very interesting. I mean, I noted the same thing when I was in Tanzania, and I had a brief meeting with the regulator, and it seems that almost all of them are pharmacists. And one could look at this from the outside and say, well, isn't this a gap potentially? Because we're now going to have to regulate devices and IVDs, which are incredibly different in almost all ways we can think of. And we have, pharmacists. And is there a gap there that you recognize in terms of just being able to handle the more technical aspect of things?
Certainly. I do think that when you look at the innovations in the health sector, it does require that regulators have a much more diverse skill set than what we typically do have.
Yeah.
So in the area of medical devices, for example, we've started, we have an area where we focus on radiation control. So there we have a lot of physicists, medical physicists, etc. We're looking to bring on board bioengineers in that space. So that's typically, someone who wouldn't even think of working for a regulator. But
For a
that's
regulator. Yeah.
that's a skill set, that we need. We need more clinicians. At the moment, again, that's another
Yeah.
area wherein there's a gap. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned previously you came in with a 100 day plan, or in your mind at least, you had this vision of, you're going to come into SAHPRA, you're going to break down the walls, you're going to do ABC. What are some of those things? Can you share with me what are some of those things that you envisioned doing when you started?
I mean, one of the priority ones for me was around change management, because, SAHPRA, when it was set up, it moved from the National Department of Health to be an autonomous entity. So there was a lot of change management to implement for that. So I had a plan of a lot of engagements with my team, communicating, a lot more in terms of our vision, starting to, bring new ways of working, because one of the other challenges that we sit with is some inefficiencies in how we work, therefore resulting in delays in registering of health products.
Okay.
So wanted to focus a lot on implementation of those new approaches to do things. And, virtually one couldn't do that. With change management, it's very difficult when you're all working remotely, and you haven't even met all the staff members, so it was really hampered by that. And we're seeing the impact of that now, as we're back in the office in a hybrid mechanism. But also we see that with new technology, with new approaches we're implementing, we're still getting a lot of barriers, because we didn't manage to have very early on these face-to-face conversations, face-to-face, deliberate on the issues, have tough conversations, debate, and then walk away with then a single approach. So those for me are the two areas where I think were negatively impacted.
Yeah, and do you think you experienced any sort of resistance internally because you came in with, let's say, like a different way of thinking, and that maybe challenged some of the internal processes and systems that were already in place? Did you feel any resistance in terms of, people that were there already, not even externally? We'll talk about that later, but just within the organization. How has that been?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are resistance, right? Particularly on like the big things that you want to change that people have been doing for many years. I mean, the regulator has been operating for more than 60 years.
Yeah.
We have some staff members that they've spent all their career with the regulator. So you can imagine you have this new person come and want to change things that you've been doing for many years, right? So there's definitely a lot of resistance. There's a lot of, kind of debates that we have on these matters. And some of them are still in process, right? So what it has required of me is that I think of creative ways of how to get alignment. Because while there is that tension, I do need those people. They have a lot of institutional knowledge. They're very skilled, right? So you don't want to lose those people. You want to bring them along.
Yeah.
That for me is the tough part.
And on the flip side of that, so there's the people, I almost said old people, but there's people that have been there for long, right? And they have all this knowledge, and maybe they have a bit of resistance to new systems and new tools, etc. And then on the other side, you have new people that are maybe coming in with dynamic ideas. So are you trying to address, or are you trying to bring in young, new people, vibrant ideas, etc.? How does that work for a regulator?
Yeah. So it's certainly, so one of my strategies was to bring in a mix. So with my executives, basically all of them except one are new. The next level of senior management, all of them except two are new, right? Just so you bring in, because you also don't want to be a lone voice, right? You want to ensure that you bring in people with other ideas, because I don't have all the ideas. And so that has helped. But again, there'll be areas where, there's initial tension. So it's that classical storm, norm, and then you thrive. So we're still very much in that storming phase.
Yeah, no, I get you. And okay, so let's get a bit technical, but not too much, right? So I often talk about SAHPRA, whether it's with my friends or my peers, etc. And a lot of people don't really know, that the medical device industry is a thing in South Africa. It doesn't occur to them necessarily. So when they hear about SAHPRA, they're like, "What? Who is SAHPRA?" Like you keep talking about SAHPRA. Can you just break down for us who SAHPRA is, but explain it to me as if I was a 10-year-old, right? who is SAHPRA? Like if I were your 10-year-old nephew or whatever, how would you explain what you do and what SAHPRA does?
Sure. So when you look at all the health products on the shelves, so let's take a simple product that we all know, like paracetamol. For it to be on the shelf, it needs to have someone that has asked three questions. Is what is claimed to be in there really in there? So is there really paracetamol in that medicine? Secondly, is the paracetamol going to manage your pain as you expect it to, right? And then thirdly, is it safe? Are there any things in there that could kill you one day, right? So those are the key three things we look at. So as a regulator, those are the questions we ask. So our role is to ensure that every health product that a consumer consumes must be safe, and it must be able to do what it claims to do. With medical devices, we want to make sure that they perform as they claim to perform, and they are safe. So if you think of an X-ray machine, you can't go there and try get an X-ray and the X-ray machine doesn't work, right? And also it needs to meet specific limits. So we make sure that health products do what they claim to do and that they are safe.
Okay, that's as concise as it could have been said. So the role of the regulator is to ensure that the health products in the country are doing what they are supposed to do and that they're safe, right? Yeah. That's basically in a nutshell. Okay, and if we get a bit more specific with medical devices, because I must say that is the focus of the podcast in general, is more on the medical device side of things. I have no expertise whatsoever in pharmaceuticals and medicines, so we'll focus more on medical devices. So what would you say is the state of the medical device industry in South Africa at this point? You know, is it where we want it to be? Is it lagging? From your perspective, what is the state of the medical device industry in South Africa?
Sure. So I would say we actually have kind of two industries, right? We have the export industry, which is very established, wherein we don't manufacture, those products locally; they are imported. So if you look at X-ray machines, etc., particularly the big machinery, the glucometers,
big medical equipment,
that is for me largely export. You then also have a nascent yet growing local industry that is starting to enter the space of in vitro diagnostic tests. I think there's a realization that with our context, we need to develop products that are easier to use, that are also relevant for our local setting, i.e., if you look at the whole issue of load shedding now, right? You need something that can utilize solar, for example. You need something that's remote, that is not located in one facility and everyone has to go there. Something that is portable can then be taken to where it's required. So we see local innovators wanting to enter that space. And so those for me are kind of the kind of two polarities within the sector.
Would you say that, let me rather give an example. Let's say I'm a local entrepreneur and I've seen the issue of load shedding, right? And I'm saying, okay, well, let's try to make medical devices. I'm trying to think of a specific one. I don't know. It's probably going to be stupid, but a stethoscope, right? That's my go-to medical device example. But we want to make, for some reason, a digital electronic stethoscope. And we want to also address the issue of load shedding in the country so that, this thing won't have to rely on a continuous power supply. It's going to be solar powered, whatever the case may be, right? As an innovator, as an entrepreneur, do you not think that in some cases I'm a bit de-incentivized to put it to the market, knowing all the regulatory sort of hurdles and barriers that I have to go through? Do you think that there's a danger that the system we're creating is actually putting people off from following the processes properly? At least it's an observation that I sometimes especially when I look at things from far, it seems that way, right? That people are very de-incentivized to create, to make new things and to put them in the market, because they know that they're going to have to go through all these regulatory barriers that, sometimes they feel are useless. Not that I agree with that. It's just the perception that I get.
Yeah. So, I always say, and I think the benefit of me having been in R&D is that I kind of understand
Mm-hmm.
both sides, and now being
Yeah.
with the regulator. For me, the
Yeah.
thing that innovators want is clarity on requirements. They want efficiency. So they want to know that when I develop a product, if I study what is on your website and I follow that process, it is indeed what is required. And when I submit a product for registration, if on your website you say it will take 3 months, then it must take 3 months, right? So the challenge is, and let's go to medical devices. So the challenge in the country with medical devices is that for the longest of time, SAHPRA or the MCC was not regulating the area. So people did whatever they did and they kind of self-regulated, right? Now, since 2017, it falls under the mandate of SAHPRA, which means that there needs to be a lot of education to say, what is SAHPRA going to do? What is SAHPRA not going to do? What is the process?
Sorry, education in terms of internally at SAHPRA or in industry?
No, with industry.
Or
with
for
industry.
everyone?
So SAHPRA needs to
Okay.
educate industry to say, now that we've started to regulate this area, what does that mean? Right? And then you need to have a lot of engagements, again, because it's a new approach. You also have to, so for example, now we published the regulations for registering medical devices and IVDs.
Yeah,
we put it out for
we'll talk
public
about
comment.
that just now.
Yes,
Yeah.
we put it out for public comment and we're considering that, right? So you need to kind of take industry along. So my view is that innovators should not be disincentivized. Entrepreneurs probably even more, right? Because we need them. Those are the people that would bring these game-changing technologies. And one acknowledgement that I have is that typically regulation lags behind innovation. Someone innovates, someone changes things drastically, and regulators say, how do we then, create control? So that's the nature of what we do. So let's take an example with COVID self-tests, right? They've been applied in many other countries, the UK, the US, and we've been getting a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And in South Africa, we then had to say, what then becomes our guidance document, right? And again, the issue is that delays. I'll be the first to acknowledge that once you have to pull various stakeholders who have various roles along the value chain, in South Africa, we battle with efficiency. And finally, we're at a point where we will be communicating in the next few days. We finalize our process on self-tests. But again, it's that frustration.
Really? Okay,
It's
that's
that
great news.
Where, innovators they see what's happening in other countries without understanding the many months that they spent, because we always are kind of lagging behind, right? And then they say, South Africa, you need to get on with it. And it just takes time. But once it's there and once it's clear, people are able to bring in products. So it really is, it needs a close working relationship between industry and the regulator.
Yeah. And what would you say is the relationship that you have with industry at the moment? Do you think it's a healthy one? Do you think it's productive? From your point of view, how do you perceive that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that with the medical devices industry, we do have we do have a very good relationship. I think they have access to us. We've created structures that I think their working group meets every month, if not every other month, wherein there is industry representation and SAHPRA, and we deal with issues around guidelines, around our requirements, etc. And so far, the feedback that I've gotten is that those engagements are working well. Obviously, you have to assess it quite regularly as new things come up, as you start to regulate. So at least the comfort that I have is that there is a mechanism in place for industry to engage with the regulator, which was not always there.
Okay. I'm inclined to push back slightly on that, but I recognize that it has gotten better. And this is from me, who relatively new in the industry. I recognize that it has gotten better from the years of, MCC transitioning to SAHPRA, etc. There's better engagement. But my pushback would be that it's one thing to have engagement, but are we actually producing any practical outcomes from these engagements? Because we can engage for many years, but actually when we leave those meetings, the regulator goes that way, industry goes that way, and then that divergence keeps increasing. That's always my worry, that yes, we can engage, we can even have these conversations, you and I, but for me the key thing is always, does something come out of that? So that's why I'm saying I'm inclined to push back, because it seems, and I'm not just saying that about SAHPRA, I'm just saying in general, it's something that we tend to do quite a lot. We have these discussions and we raise awareness, but things really move quite slowly because it takes us maybe like 10 years to actually put in place the system we spoke about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
So not quite,
That
right?
claim? Yeah.
No, not
Mhm.
quite. I think there are elements of
Okay.
it that are correct. Let me talk about what
Okay.
I don't agree with. I do think
Sure.
if I consider the medical devices area, the benefit that
Yeah.
those engagements have had are around
Mhm.
really the pain points on guidelines, on what is it that the regulator expects, when
Okay.
are you going to do what, etc. I think what one of the challenges with all of these platforms that we have is
Uh-huh.
it's with industry associations. So if an entrepreneur, who has a company that they've just set up is not part of that association, they then will not have access to the regulator, right? Because it is
Yeah,
at an
fair enough.
association
Fair enough.
level. So I think that for me is where there's a gap. And we've seen in the medicines area wherein, people are very intentional about creating associations and then that association then having a voice. Because again, we're not going to engage with all 50 companies, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to work. But with an
No,
association,
absolutely.
we can send through. So I think for me, it's these from an industry perspective, it's not a good representation of all the kinds of companies that we have
Fair enough.
and even the innovators. So I do think that there's a need and there's a gap there for a medical devices. I mean, if I think of some of the diagnostic companies in Cape Town, etc. I don't know if they're represented in these fora, right? Because it's big
I get you.
industries.
And I would even go as far as saying that maybe some companies, some entrepreneurs don't want to join these organizations because they say, well, it's probably just going to be a dialogue that's going to result in more dialogue. I would rather try to sell in Europe or America and just follow that route. Do you think that's a possibility? That there's a lot of companies that actually, they almost, how can I say this? They almost are bypassing the potential engagement that they could have had with the regulator because they're seeing it. And I'm speaking maybe even from experience, anecdotal experience with some clients, etc. Right, where they feel like, well, we might as well just, like, who needs SAHPRA? I mean, sure, we need the establishment license, we need to put those things in place, but they almost don't worry about the South African market because they just see it as moving really slowly. Do you agree with that, or have you seen that as well?
So I've seen that, right? But it's actually it's not
Hmm.
just about the regulatory issues. I think medical devices, we always say the barriers there are less than the barriers with medicines, but their barriers are
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah.
What we've seen is, again, the other issue is the South African market is small. So the question becomes, why must I put in all this effort to get a SAHPRA
Yeah.
registration, and yet my big market and my big revenue is going to come outside of the country, right? And so I think it's almost a combination of both. And the thing about the point wherein I wanted to say I agree with you is that, and being now on the other side, I realize the complexity of this, particularly with all these legal challenges that we face, right? That by the time that a regulator puts out a position, a guideline, a framework, etc., you need to consider all ends, right? So if you think of the regulations now, some of the feedback we've received from industry has led us to a point where we need to engage with legal to say, actually, we see
Mhm.
where industry is
Right.
going here. What are the legal ramifications of that, right?
Right.
So it may seem like we're
Yeah.
dragging our feet, but in the back end,
I get you.
So there's many considerations. And I'll give you an example. I mean, with with the COVID vaccines, you may have seen that some organizations have taken us to court for authorizing vaccines for 12 to 17-year-olds, and they literally want to see everything that we've done, every single piece of documentation, right? Which says, as a regulator, you must make sure that you've got proper processes and systems and legal frameworks for you to be able to come out with a decision. So I think, and my view with the team was that let's invest the time, particularly with medical devices, getting things right with these regulations so that when we start implementing, we don't have a lot of comebacks. There are a number of our regulations that other associations are challenging. They've taken us to court. The complementary medicines regulation. We currently have a court case on that, right? So you really want to make sure that you learn from that and you do things differently. It takes long, but it means that then when we start implementing, there's then alignment.
Yeah. I want to take maybe a step back. So there's a saying that says, don't reinvent the wheel. And so you spoke about the technical groups that you engage with that are particularly involved in giving their input on guidelines and that sort of thing. One of the questions that I tried not to take questions. I mean, I know a bunch of people. I told them, like, if you have any questions, let me know. And I'm not trying to do too much of that. But one question stood out for me, and it was the organizations like the IMDRF and the EMA, they have, especially IMDRF, they have guidelines that have been aligned even with the WHO recommendations. How much of that do we take and just apply it here? I mean, I understand we might have to change a few things to make it relevant for our market. But is there ever a sense that you get that we're maybe trying to do too much and we can actually use what's already there? Or is it more complex than that?
So there's a level of complexity. So, I mean, we're observers of IMDRF. And so a lot of what we do, actually, we borrow from that. So if you look at the reliance, so if you look at PCR tests, for example, with PCR tests for COVID, we said if you are registered, or authorized by one of the IMDRF members, with South Africa, we're going to rely on it. So we moved quickly.
Fair enough.
So that we're doing. There's also now the AMDRF, the African Medical Devices Regulatory Forum, wherein we're part of the steering committee. So the intention is indeed to harmonize with those, to borrow from those. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but also you need to then bring in the local context within there, and that's where we then nuance.
And with the legal aspect.
Yeah.
Okay, no, I get you. Okay, so there is a alignment, or at least a desire to always have alignment. But I think maybe something that people don't always understand, and I must also apologize for my general critique of SAHPRA, where there are maybe some legal ramifications that we don't think about that you guys have to deal with. A good example is the medical device regulations, which I also want to touch a bit on that, right? So there was a draft that went out to the public for comment. And like you said, you're now sitting with a case where you have to figure out a bunch of legal ramifications. And I think a lot of people are asking, well, when are these regulations going to come out? Are they coming out? Like, what is it going to look like? Can you maybe talk on timelines for that?
Yeah, I mean, this has taken longer than I personally expected, right? But when we engaged on the feedback, there were some points that we couldn't just either ignore or just incorporate as they were. It needed us to consider the act, consider various scenarios, and say.
Can you give me one example, if you don't mind?
So,
sorry.
For example, I think there's one where there was. The one issue that's coming up is how we define, a manufacturer, a distributor, a wholesaler, and there's a requirement there that if you are a wholesaler, you can only buy from a licensed manufacturer. So kind of that the roles of the different players along the value chain and what can be done by whom, right? Which a lot of it kind of we borrowed from the medicines. But when you look at medical devices, it could be slightly different. So again, it talks to issues of who then becomes the one who's accountable. So if something goes wrong with a certain product, if we then say that a wholesaler can buy from anyone, who then becomes accountable for that? So it's kind of those clarities that we need to bring in them. I think the other one was around some of the definitions. And, one would think definitions are simple, but man, in a regulatory space, definitions are quite challenging. I mean, one definition we have is a definition of cell. It's been challenged many times because it's so broad, and even some activities that others don't consider cell. When you look at our definition in the Act, it means to sell, right? So it's those, what any other person, even for me, prior to joining SAHPRA, would say, but sell is sell, right? As long as it's moving from one person to another. But it's actually not that simple. I think probably one of the things that I thought you were actually going to say was that we probably need to give feedback. I think we don't communicate enough. I think it is at a juncture where, for example, we should have issued a statement to say, we received comments by such a time, the process is still taking place internally. This is, revised timelines. I think that's something that we don't do enough.
Why do you think that doesn't happen?
I think we
as
just have
simple
so
as it
many
is.
things. We have many things on our table. I will tell you that much. I mean, it's one of those where I think we get so caught into and I mean, one of the things we're doing is I'm strengthening our comms office, because it is, we get so caught in trying to get the work done with a very small team. I mean, if I can share with you, when we did our structure looking at the products, the applications that we've been receiving over the last, say, 3 years, the scope expansion, we need close to 500 technical people in the regulator. We're currently sitting, including non-technical, we're sitting at about 276. And of that 276, we have probably 70 who are more administrative. So we're undercapacitated. So you can imagine the same team that's dealing with the regulations is the same team that's doing the self-test, guideline. It's the same team that's licensing entities. I mean, my medical devices team, I think, has 5 people. And they must do all of that. So you understand? So like you're getting applications to license, and we must meet those time frames. You've got all the COVID tests that are coming in, and then you must come up with a guideline. And then, so it's a lot considering, and we have a small team. So, I mean, we've been engaging with National Treasury to try to get more money, because it's not sustainable. There's a lot we need to do.
Yeah. What about, you might have heard, before I go on, I don't want to self-promote or anything like that, but I feel like this is the right time to do that. So there's a industry group, you might have heard of them, the MDPG, the Medical Devices Professional Group, which I'm part of. And basically it's a group of independent regulatory and quality assurance consultants. And we basically have clients in the market that are typically manufacturers, distributors, wholesalers, etc. And the bulk of the work we do is actually taking them through the regulatory process. And my understanding, again, I'm relatively new in the industry. I kind of just jumped in. My understanding is that there has been a call to SAHPRA to say, we're here, we're ready to help, reach out to us. Is this something that you consider? Are you allowed to even take, private company help into SAHPRA? Because I know that there are certain legal processes and bureaucratic things that I don't understand. But basically, there's an open call from MDPG saying, well, here, we're more than willing to come and assist, to look at some of the processes, to maybe even do some training, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, there's a money issue. Like, we need to have money to hire people to actually reach that capacity that you mentioned. But at the same time, at the moment, what we can do is maybe have more, we talked about engagement previously, right? Maybe have more meaningful engagement with groups like the MDPG, which is a very, very technical group, and the expertise lies in the regulatory processes, right? So what are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah. So I mean, having been in R&D, I always marvel at how various associations and industry and funders are always very keen to support the regulator. I always say when I was in R&D, we were begging, we were more than begging. Whereas, as a
Really?
regulator, people are offering, to assist.
Yeah.
So the challenge with having those
Yeah.
who are industry or those who would at some point be applicants or represent applicants is this whole conflict of interest. And it all comes from a good heart, because if SAHPRA works, you guys are efficient, you can do your work, your clients can work, patients can
Yeah, but
access
there's some conflict.
and there is that kind of conflict of interest, and so that's what we're needing to manage, and that's why where support is easier for us to accept is with philanthropic organizations, etc. Those organizations who would, and our test for conflict is: are you representing someone, or are you someone who will at some point apply to SAHPRA? And if you are, then there's a conflict of interest, right? So what
Okay.
we have done is created then mechanisms, through philanthropic organizations. So, for example, we have a project with Alma Philanthropies, wherein they're assisting us around capacitating. It's a lot of helping us to develop some of our frameworks. So even once we have the guidelines, we're going to have the SOPs and all of that, right? So they're going to assist us with that. And Alma Philanthropies works because they're not an applicant to SAHPRA. But what could happen is
Right.
MDGP can then partner with Alma Philanthropies to say, you know what, we've got resources, that we can provide to you and you can provide to SAHPRA because you are the neutral body in this, right?
Sure.
And for example, things like training, right? If we then put out a call through the funding that we have from Alma Philanthropies, you guys can then respond to that and say you're willing to offer training. Because again, training is an easier one because no single entity benefits. It
Right.
the whole industry, so there is no conflict, so to say, because it's you can't pinpoint and say, oh, okay, a Roche Diagnostic benefited, right? It's everyone. SAHPRA is adequately trained. So I think that the issue is really that conflict of interest. But we've got Alma Philanthropies who will be working with us. We have another US-based organization that will be helping us because of the acknowledgement that we don't have sufficient capacity, yet we need to get these things done. So there'll be people who will be seconded, etc. People who are ex-regulators or something like that. So, I mean, there's a lot happening in this place, but, there's just a limit in terms of who can support us directly.
I mean,
And
fair enough.
my recommendation is, and we're always open to engaging, which is something I've brought into the organization. I think the association needs to write to SAHPRA and ask that, we have regular engagements with you, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know,
think
you
they
say
have
that,
written.
I'm not sure, they may have reached out to the market, so I'm not sure.
It's the MDPG, the Medical Device Professionals Group. I won't mention any names or anything like that. Just to
who's the chair or something? Maybe I'll recognize the name.
It is Miss Simone Short.
Oh, is it Simone?
You
Okay,
probably,
all right. I know Simone. Yes.
I mean, I think she has engaged with you, and I think they would say, I'm not even that directly involved. I'm part of it, but I'm not
I think
always
they are
directly involved. But
they're
on the
actually
working group,
represented on the working group. Yeah. No, they are. If you mean, because I knew Simone specifically. Yeah, she represented. I didn't know it was this MDPG, but I know she was with some association. No, they are.
I think the direct call, from what I understand from MDPG, is we are here to help, and let's have. It seems like what we're saying or what they're saying is let's engage less and let's start doing more. Right? Let's actually just start doing stuff. That's what the urgency seems like to me. But I completely get the potential conflict of interest, and I would like to think that there are ways to work around that, especially with these philanthropic groups. And I'm sure there's different mechanisms we can use to actually address some of these conflict of interest issues. But yeah, it's good to understand it from your perspective. We've been talking for about 45 minutes, and definitely I could go on. I do have maybe one more question that I can address from a. Let me just see any questions that came through. Just give me a second. The emergency use authorization for COVID-19. Until what point will that be active? What is the plan there?
Yeah. So the plan is that with all COVID related tests, so let me backtrack. Remember, we're not registering medical devices and IVDs at this point, right? So you list them in your license.
Yeah.
So with COVID tests, so for as long as it's a COVID related product, it will always require that it undergoes some kind of authorization, right? And the intention is that once we then have the regs implemented, you then are able to submit that then for registration, which, considering all the reviews that's been done, it will go a lot quicker and will communicate then a call-up process. So it's a difficult one for me to say because, for now, I mean, the critical issue for now was around the self-tests, right? So there needed to be very clear guidance on that. And if you look at what we've done with PCRs and with the rapid tests, I think we are at a point where we know enough about these tests. And you may have seen, I think the team has issued communication. If they haven't, I'm sure they'll issue it soon, in terms of just relaxing some of the validation requirements, because we have a lot more comfort now around, these tests. So we'll continuously modify the requirements, but as long as they're COVID related, we would still need to have them authorized. And then when we register, they'll just then fall into a registration bucket.
Okay, no, that's good to know. I actually had one final personal question that I completely forgot. Oh, there we go. So just to end off, do you think that you are maybe unfairly criticized as the head of SAHPRA, or do you ignore sort of those negative comments that are not necessarily, conducive or productive? How do you experience that? It must be quite a lot of pressure personally.
Yeah, I always say when you are in a position of leadership, when you are an influencer to some extent in a sector, as a regulator is, you'll always have critique. So one must just develop a thick skin, right? There'll be things that we do that people don't like. Some people will take you to court for it. Some people will have all these comments that they make. There'll be things that you do that people like. So for me, it's kind of filtering. I think there's some critique that's positive that we take on board, that I take on board. And I say, how does that make us a better entity? And how does that make me a better leader? There are some that I let it go in one ear and out the other because, it's just not worth me spending time on.
Yeah, no, and I definitely have to commend you for the work that you're doing, and for I think we don't always realize what it's like to be leading everything, because we're kind of on the other side, right? So I definitely commend you, and also being a Black woman in this position of influence, also commend you for that. I'm sure that comes with its own host of challenges and whatever opportunities. So yeah, absolutely commend you for that. My aim from this conversation, like I said before, was to actually understand the person a bit better, and hopefully this opens up a channel for us to communicate more and engage more. As you said, you're open to engagement, and I can see your keenness toward that. And hopefully this sets the tone for that. And yeah, it's been great talking to you, Dr. Tumi, not the musician. And I really hope that this leads to more fruitful conversations and, just building something great together in South Africa.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, thanks for reaching out. I think, I always appreciate an opportunity to engage, communicate with the public, because as you said, there's a lot that happens in the background that people don't know. Any opportunity that we can utilize to share, to communicate, I'm always open to that, because it just takes us a lot further. So, I'm happy to have probably a similar conversation, even, once we then finalize the regs, right? Because it would be important probably that we then communicate a lot to industry. So, again, podcasts for me are great, because while you're in the gym, on your bike, on the treadmill, you can listen to it, right?
Yeah.
So, happy to do that, with you guys when we then have the regs. I think it will be a good follow up.
I will hold you to that, and we'll try to organize that. But thank you so much. And that's it. That's it for me. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. Have a good day further. Sure.
You too. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this engaging conversation. To find out more about InfoMed, visit infomed-consult.org. See you next time.